In the far reaches of the valley of Eld Hollow there lived a farmer named Bram Morsel, a man whose soul had hardened like sun-baked clay, whose eyes burned not with wisdom or love for land, but with a ruthless desire to control every inch beneath his boots. His ancestors had once worshipped the earth, sung to the trees, danced in the winds that swept the high meadows, but Bram had no patience for such whimsy. Where his father saw wonder, he saw weakness. Where his mother whispered tales of tree spirits and bird mothers protecting their nests, he scoffed and swung his axe deeper. Bram's land, once lush with sprawling oaks, sun-sipping elms, and whispering pines that housed generations of birds, insects, and creatures of lore, began to change under his wrath. It started one season when the crops began to dwindle, and he blamed the trees, accusing them of drinking too deeply from the soil, shading the corn, sheltering birds that stole seeds. So he issued a cruel decree to his workers. Every tree must fall, from the orchard border to the ridge of Sparrow's Cliff, and if a nest was found, it too must burn. No creature would be spared, no songbird given mercy. At first, the villagers begged him to reconsider. Even his wife, a quiet woman named Althea, wept at the feet of an old yew tree, pleading with Bram to let it stand, for it was where her mother was buried beneath, and every spring it bloomed white flowers. But Bram, cold and unmoved, laughed at her sorrow and had it chopped down while she screamed. The villagers grew silent after that. One by one the trees fell. The sky, once filtered through gentle canopies, now blazed harsh and exposed. The wind that once played through branches now howled across barren fields like a wolf in mourning. And then strange things began to happen. First, the crows stopped flying over Eld Hollow, then the foxes disappeared. Then came the storm, sudden and howling. Though no clouds had gathered, it uprooted the last standing elm and sent it crashing through Bram's grain silo. People whispered of curses, of spirits woken from their slumber. But Bram only worked harder, his axe becoming an extension of his will. He slept with it beside his bed, oiled the blade like a beloved pet. His heart began to blacken as the tree stumps spread like tumors across his lands. One morning his workers found him not in bed, but standing atop a pile of burning nests, his face smeared with ash, whispering to someone invisible. They feared him then, not just for his cruelty, but for something deeper, something unhinged. The birds never returned, nor did the rain. The soil turned to powder, the crops failed completely, and still Bram refused to acknowledge fault. He began patrolling the fields at night with his axe, convinced that some great beast was lurking among the shadows of dead trees, watching him. It wasn't long before his wife left. She packed no clothes, spoke no words, just walked barefoot into the mist toward the old forest beyond the hill, and no one ever saw her again. That same night, Bram claimed he saw eyes glowing in the darkness, peering from stumps and trunks, whispering his name. He screamed at them to leave, but they only laughed, in a language that echoed like creaking bark. The axe slipped from his hand then, not because he dropped it, but because it rejected him. It fell to the dirt and rusted before his eyes. The next morning the villagers discovered that every last tree he had chopped had grown back overnight, taller, darker, and twisted, as if reborn in vengeance. Bram's house was now at the center of a new forest, one that didn't exist on any map, and from that moment Bram Morsel was never seen again. Some say he walks the forest still, an old man with bark for skin, muttering apologies to nests long gone. But tales do not die when the villains vanish. They ferment in silence, take root beneath the soil of generations, and bloom when least expected. 50 winters had passed since the forest reclaimed Bram Morsel's lands, and time had dulled the memory of his madness. Children grew into farmers, farmers into merchants, and Eld Hollow became a place of cautious reverence. They built around the forest now called Wraithwood, not daring to cut its edge. For anyone who entered never returned, not hunters, not explorers, not even animals. That is, until a man arrived from the north, cloaked in knowledge and shadow. Calling himself Master Thorlon, he claimed he could tame Wraith. He was no farmer, but a scholar of forgotten things, one who had studied cursed lands, hexed trees, and whispers that traveled through roots. He convinced the elders to let him build a tower at the edge of the forest. With silver hair, black gloves, and eyes too bright to be natural, he offered hope. If he could understand the magic of Wraithwood, perhaps they could reclaim the land. And so began the second tale, one of a master, not of land, but of words and riddles and power that should never be handled by man. Thorlon built his tower, brick by brick, surrounded by books, strange runes, and creatures in jars. He spoke to the forest at night in an old tongue, his voice merging with wind and shadow. He fed it blood animal at first, then birds, then something worse. Soon, the trees began to move slightly closer to his tower each morning, bending unnaturally, curious, or hungry. He smiled at their interest. Villagers avoided the place now, crossing themselves as they passed. Tholon hired a servant, a local orphan girl named Lyra, mute but clever. She cleaned his tower, copied his runes, and followed him into the woods, with her eyes wide open. Tholon was not cruel in the way Bram was. His punishments were mental, not physical. When displeased, he forced Lyra to stare into jars containing whispering moths that made one forget their name for a day. But she never broke, and perhaps that amused him. Over time, Lyra discovered secrets. She found Bram's name in one of Tholon's tomes, found drawings of nests, maps of the old forest before it twisted. One night, she followed Tholon deep into Wraithwood and saw him speak to a tree that opened like a mouth. Its tongue a black vine, its breath foul with rot. She heard a voice respond, Bram's voice. He was alive, in a manner of speaking merged into the roots, his body long devoured, his soul stretched thin and tormented. The trees had not just grown back, they had consumed him, made him part of their chorus. Tholon was trying to harness that pain, bottle it, use it as a source of eternal magic. Lyra fled the tower that night, but not before stealing a vial glowing with green liquid, the essence of sorrow from the tree where Bram's mind remained trapped. She did not know what it would do, only that it must not stay. From the broken center of Eldhallow rose, not just trees, but memories that had never died. Lyra, once a mute girl, now spoke in a voice layered with echoes, hers, Bram's, the birds, the wind, and something older. The vial she carried pulsed, with the sorrow of centuries, and as she uncorked it above the mouth of the chasm, the ground convulsed and the trees wept sap like tears. From the roots, not screams, but lullabies rose ancient, lullabies sung by bird mothers long turned to ash. The villagers watched in paralyzed awe as nests began to form mid-air, spiraling from branches that hadn't existed a moment ago. Eggs glowed with golden light, feathers fell like snow, and every sound seemed to harmonize into one overwhelming note of reckoning. Tholon tried to intervene, chanting spells now feeble, runes that sparked and died in his mouth. The forest turned on him not with fire or blade, but with mercy. It encased him in bark, root, and moss, leaving him alive, eternally dreaming of power he could never reach. Lyra approached the center of the chasm, now glowing with green light and swirling roots. She stepped inside and was not consumed, but embraced. The forest crowned her with a nest of silver feathers and crowned her their warden. She became something more than human, her body a silhouette of bark, her eyes twin suns of emerald grief. She spoke to the villagers then not in threat, but in warning. All things must nest before they fly. You will plant what you harvest, and your children will remember the trees. Then she vanished into the canopy, and every villager felt a seed placed in their palms soft, glowing, and warm. From that day, no one chopped a tree without permission. Birds returned, rain fell, crops bloomed. Eldhallow lived not beside the forest, but with it, and at the heart of Wraithwood where no one dared tread. The tallest tree bore a face in its bark, a man forever whispering apologies, while a girl watched him, surrounded by nests that would never fall again. The winds that followed the night of nesting did not howl but hummed, not with anger but memory, on ancient tune that echoed through the bark of every tree that now bowed slightly toward the heart of Wraithwood, where the tree woman stood unseen, her body rooted beneath the surface, yet her presence felt across the valley like the sun's warmth before dawn. Lyra, or what once was Lyra, had not vanished but evolved, becoming the warden of the nest. Her thoughts threaded through leaves, her breath exhaled from moss, her heart beat in rhythm with the blooming cycles of roots and resurrection. And yet, far from Eldhallow, beyond the thickets and fog that guarded the cursed perimeter, a new settlement had begun to rise, one of brick and brass, of laws and lamps and books that denied anything they could not dissect. They called themselves the New Lineage, settlers from the iron-laden coast who fled the famine of the north, bringing with them steam-powered carts, logic-driven minds, and a contempt for oral traditions and whispering trees. They heard of Eldhallow through passing tradesmen who spoke nervously of the living forest, the tree that birthed eggs of light, and the woman made of wood who sang to the wind. And while most laughed it off as superstitious poetry of simple farmers, one man took interest with a gleam in his eye, Professor Tholon, a descendant of the very man who once tried to enslave Wraithwood with runes and blood. He was tall, like his ancestor, but leaner, sharper, his skin paler, his voice more persuasive than commanding, and he arrived with his apprentice and a caravan of thinkers, scientists, tinkerers, and young men eager to carve truth from myth. They settled on the outskirts of Eldhallow, established the Observatory of Recovered Myth, and began daily expeditions into the fog. But it was not fog anymore, it was breath, and it inhaled their scents, their words, their instruments, tasting for danger, remembering pain. Lyra knew. She saw through every fern and petal, felt the vibration of footfalls, the hum of thoughtless chatter, the scrape of metal against root, and though she did not wish war, she sensed the return of arrogance. Among the newcomers was a girl of 17, named Callan, curious and soft-eyed, daughter of one of the tinkerers. But unlike her father, she spent her nights not drafting machines but sketching trees, not testing theories but listening to birds. One night, as she followed a robin deeper into the woods, she saw a nest suspended mid-air, untouched by branch or breeze, glowing faintly like a distant planet. She reached toward it and heard a voice not outside but inside her ribs. To touch the egg is to carry the sorrow. She stepped back. Her breath shook. She ran, but she returned the next day, and the next, and the next. And eventually the trees began to part gently for her, whispering in rustled syllables. She became the first among the new lineage to believe not in conquest but in communion. But Professor Wren grew impatient. He spoke in the assembly with urgency, displaying rotting roots collected from the forest edge, claiming the land was diseased, that it harbored old gods that must be neutralized for progress to flourish. He drafted plans to build a containment chamber at the base of Wraithwood, one that would extract soul residues from its roots for experimentation. Eldhallow's people, wiser now and loyal to the balance, warned him, pleaded, even showed him the graves of those who vanished before, but Wren saw only weakness in their reverence. One night, as the fog thickened and the trees grew still, Wren led a crew of 5 into Wraithwood, carrying lanterns of sulfur and knives etched with sigils. They did not return. Only Callan heard their screams, carried on the wind like broken promises. She followed their path at dawn, drawn not by duty but by morning, and in a glade of silver dew she found their tools laid in a circle, clean, untouched in the center. A sapling with 5 branches, each pulsating faintly like veins. A voice rose behind her, not spoken, but layered in the leaves. Every wound becomes root, every silence becomes branch. Lyra stood behind her, not in flesh but in form, tall, serene, sorrowful. Callan fell to her knees. I didn't know, she whispered, teach me. And so began a new age, not of resistance, but of reconciliation. Lyra showed her the archives etched in bark, the memories stored in moss, the songs sung to lost trees. Callan became a Bridger seedling, as the forest named her. But outside the forest, new lineage officials declared war on superstition. They sent machines, drones, fire beetles, not knowing that technology is still made from earth and earth remembers betrayal. Machines rusted before entry. Drones fell from the sky. The trees did not attack, they simply refused. Refused to yield, to be understood, to be mapped. One night, in a desperate last act, the new lineage launched a sonic bomb meant to shatter root communication. It detonated. The earth split, and from the wound rose not fire or smoke but a tree unlike any other, tall as mountains, glowing gold at the top, black at the base, its bark engraved with every name forgotten by greed. At its roots sat Lyra, eyes closed, arms open. Around her, nests floated like lanterns, and behind her stood Callan, now taller, her eyes silver, her veins etched with light. She spoke once, and the wind carried her words across the entire region. No more axes, no more chains, only roots and wings. The forest bloomed in answer. The wind had changed it, not just in direction, but in nature, no longer a simple conveyor of pollen or weather, but a weaver of memory, song, and warning, as it curled through the massive tree of names that had risen like a colossus from the ruptured land where the arrogance of man detonated its last desperate defiance against the wild. And beneath its massive canopy that now spread shadows across mountains and seas, the forest of whispers extended its reach, not with violence but with inevitability, growing silently and patiently, like wisdom returning to a place from which it had long been banished. Lyra, now an eternal warden whose essence flowed through every root, every bird, every glowing nest, stood no longer alone. Beside her stood Callan, reborn not by ritual but by resonance, her body now marked with sigils, not drawn by hand but grown by light, her eyes silver as the inner bark of sacred trees, her breath humming with the lost songs of 1,000 bird-mothers. And around her began to gather the root-born, the first generation of those not born from wombs alone but from the symbiosis of human resilience and forest memory. children who emerged from hollowed trunks wrapped in moss and feather, speaking in syllables that echoed across root lines before they could walk. They were not many at first, 5, then 9, then 23, carrying a fragment of a forgotten language, each with skin like bark or hair like ferns or fingers tipped with leaf veins that glowed when truth was spoken, and the people of Eld Hollow, now devoted protectors of balance, welcomed them as messengers of harmony, builders of a new way. But peace never remains untouched for long, for beyond the reach of Wraithwood, across the plains and into the steel cities of the northern rails, word of the miracle children spread, twisted in retellings, packaged in paranoia, described not as root-born but as abominations of wood and witchcraft. And so from the cold towers of Silveranth came the Iron Watch, a military faction forged from what remained of the old world order, men and women clad in armor woven with light and logic-infused scripture, whose doctrine forbade all organic memory systems as unstable repositories of chaos, led by Commander Maya Daskala, woman born into silence after her homeland was swallowed by floods and who had sworn vengeance on all things. Uncontrolled, they marched south with skyships and biomech hounds, their goal not to negotiate, but to sterilize the anomaly that Wraithwood had become. The Rootborn sensed them first, not as silhouettes on the horizon but as a coldness in the bark, a shivering of petals, a hush in birdsong that felt like morning rehearsed too soon. And Lyra, though Returnal, felt something old stir within her, something close to fear. She summoned the forest's council, not of humans, but of the sentient groves, ancient trees that had watched over empires, each marked with a face like weathered stone, each rooted so deep that they touched the dreams of the planet itself. Among them, the eldest, the Thornmother, spoke slowly, her words carried by falling leaves. If iron comes to erase us, then we must remember louder. And so began the ceremony of deep memory, a gathering not of warriors but of all who carried story or hollow villages, root-born children, even creatures of myth who had returned in secret, antlered owls, fire beetles with runes on their wings, the last whisper fox of the moaning glen. They danced and sang beneath the tree of names, telling stories with their bodies, etching myths into the sky with glowing pollen, so that when the Iron Watch finally arrived with their fleets and their cold logic, they were met not with swords but with a storm of memory so thick and radiant, it halted their machines. But Commander Maya was not moved by beauty, she saw it as manipulation. She unleashed the purifier drones, weaponized sound pulses meant to scramble organic nervous systems. The sky screamed, trees shook, the Rootborn fell to their knees, and Callan, eyes bleeding silver, screamed not in pain but in defiance, raising her hands to the sky where clouds churned, and from her palms erupted twin ribbons of light. Not fire, not lightning, but the very first language. The language of birds, of water, of time. It struck the drones mid-air and rewrote them into crystallized seeds that fell harmlessly to the ground. The skyships malfunctioned, plummeted softly into moss beds. The soldiers panicked, but the forest did not kill them. Instead, it enfolded them in hallucinations of their own childhoods, showing them their first sorrow, their first laughter, the moment they forgot how to listen. Most wept, some broke. Commander Maya, resisting, charged toward the tree of names, blade drawn, screaming that the world must be clean, silent, perfect, and she was met at the base by Lyra herself, who stepped from the trunk as if born anew, her form now taller than any human, her voice layered like 1,000 leaves. Perfection is silence, she said, but life is song. She touched Maya's forehead, and the commander dropped her weapon, weeping for her drowned homeland, her lost siblings, her forgotten lullabies. She knelt, not in defeat but in remembrance, and so the Iron Watch dissolved, not in battle but in blooming. Many chose to remain, to learn, to plant trees where they had once poured concrete. Callan became known as the Dawnroot, and the Rootborn grew in number, teaching the world not how to dominate but how to harmonize. The cities that once rejected Wraithwood began to open their gates to the wind, their buildings transformed with living walls, their machines powered not by oil but by rhythm, and beneath it all, the forest pulsed not with vengeance, but with vision. The story was far from over, for deep beneath the roots, older forces stirred things that remembered even before Bram's first axe stroke, before the first tree fell, before man forgot the sound of his own soul. But for now Wraithwood stood not as warning, but as witness. Beneath the whispering roots of Wraithwood, deeper than memory, beyond even the reach of Lyra's consciousness, beyond where the sentient groves extended their thought, lay something ancient and listening, not a creature or a tree or even a god, but a thought so old it had never been spoken aloud, a hunger older than forests, older than light, older than memory itself, a thing buried in stone, sealed away when the world was still young and the stars had not yet fixed their place in the sky. And though the surface sang and the rootborn danced, and the tree of names lit up like a second sun over the new lands blooming around this thing stirred, drawn by the friction of change, by the friction of story and structure, song and silence. It had no name, only intention, a negation of growth, of color, of becoming, a desire to unravel all stories back to stillness. And it waited patiently, knowing that even the deepest root eventually seeks the hollow underneath. Far above, life flourished in its own rhythm. Callan, now revered as the dot root, moved among nations like a breeze moved through silksoft, unnoticed by the arrogant, but undeniably transformative, carrying seeds not only of plant but of thought, planting root born in schools, libraries, laboratories, and halls of policy. And yet even as peace blossomed and machines began to grow like trees rather than devour them, she felt a quiet unraveling at the edge of her perception, like a note missing from a song she had always known by heart. The rootborn began to dream at first, just symbols, spirals drawn into dust, patterns whispered in sleep. Then came the forgetting. One by one, certain rootborn children would wake up and stare at their hands, unsure of what they were, who they were, sometimes weeping, sometimes silent for days. Lyra, sensing the disturbance, summoned the sentient groves again, who opened their bark faces with deep groans of worry, and spoke of something lost, not a war, but a seed, a pact broken so long ago none remembered what it was, but all agreed that the song below stone was returning. The Thorn Mother, eldest of them all, said this. Even before the first tree grew, there was silence, not the peace of silence, but the absence. It was defeated once by the first birdsong, but it remembers. To understand the danger, Lyra called upon the deep Haloa tree, not born in sunlight, but grown upside down beneath the earth, where roots were leaves and memory ran backward. There she met the one who was forgetting, a creature who once was a man and now was something else, bound to a stone tablet made of fossilized breath. He said, "The silence is not coming. It is already here. It walks in the forgotten. It eats memory." Callan, fearing for her people, gathered the eldest rootborn, those who had stood during the Iron Watch collapse, those with roots that threaded through continents, and they created the Circle of Recall, a ritual in which they would sing their names every sunrise and sunset, not for ego, but for preservation. But even this was not enough. Birds began flying into the sea, flowers bloomed and withered within an hour, rivers forgot their paths and pooled in deserts. The world was fraying, not from outside but within, from the collapse of narrative thread. And then, a rootborn named Thea vanished, not died, vanished. No one remembered her face. Her parents wept without knowing who they wept for. Her home was empty, her name erased even from the bark it had been carved into. It was as if she had never been. Callan screamed, summoned all the birds of the canopy, who spiraled in a storm over the tree of names, trying to trace the vacuum but found only cold wind and silence. Lyra retreated into the core of the tree, dug deeper, followed the oldest root into stone, past fossils of cities, bones of forgotten species, memories encased in amber, and there, beyond even the reach of air, she found it, the core of stillness, a sphere blacker than pitch, pulsing once every eternity, a thing that had no sound, no light, only weight. It spoke to her without words. It offered her peace, not joy, not unity, not victory, just peace. "End the song, and you end sorrow," it promised. Lyra wept. She returned to the surface changed, her bark skin pale, her eyes shadowed, her breath shallowed. She did not speak for 3 days, and on the 4th, she said only this: "We must go deeper than root. We must become story itself." The rootborn began the great archive, not of books, but of living memory. They assigned trees to hold dreams, mushrooms to absorb secrets, even certain animals to memorize chants. Every story, every name, every sorrow was encoded into life itself, making the forest not just a habitat, but a conscious entity, a fortress of narrative. But the silence responded. It sent its avatars, men and women with blank eyes and featureless faces, who walked into cities, towns, villages, and simply stood. And wherever they stood, people began forgetting their own names. Resistance was futile. They could not be reasoned with, nor killed, for they were not people but projections of unbeing. Callan called a meeting at the World Root, the convergence of all root systems, where every plant, animal, and rootborn was invited. "We must do what no story has done," she said. "We must give the silence a name." And so they did. They called it Nullum, the erasure, given form, the echo with no voice. Naming it gave shape. and with shape came vulnerability. They built songs to trap it, roots to confuse it, light to blind it. But it learned, it adapted, it grew inside the minds of the old. The war was no longer fought with weapons, but with memory. People whispered their names into leaves and wore them around their necks. Trees sang lullabies to children every hour. Dreams became battlefields. One night the tree of names dimmed. Callan climbed it alone, touched its heart, and felt it flicker. Lyra joined her. "It is dying," she whispered, not from attack, but from doubt. And Callan made a decision. She would enter Nullum's heart. She would take her memory into the dark and sing it until the silence shattered. She kissed Lyra's forehead, whispered every song she ever knew, then descended beneath stone, alone, singing. The world above waited. 1 day, 2 a week. The birds stopped singing, the leaves stopped rustling, and then one morning a note, not loud, not triumphant, just a single, perfect note, carried on the wind. The tree of names pulsed. Once with light, Callan's voice returned, and the silence screamed.